She married him hoping her past would disappear, but instead it followed her into their bedroom. 6 months of distance, 6 months of confusion, and one moment of jealousy that finally broke her silence. Boston had always been a city of contrasts. Harsh winters paired with warm neighborhoods, towering corporate buildings shadowing cozy cafes, and streets that seemed to breathe history even as they welcomed change. On the December evening Daniel Spencer first saw Abigail Lake. The city outside was crusted with the soft white of a new snowfall. But inside the rooftop lounge, where a mutual friend's birthday party was taking place, everything glowed with amber light and the hum of laughter. Daniel had arrived late, straight from a board meeting, still in his charcoal suit. He was used to walking into rooms and commanding attention without meaning to. That night was no different. Several people greeted him at once, some with business pitches disguised as friendly conversation. But his eyes drifted past all of them and landed on a woman seated near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate instead of alcohol. Abigail, she, was composed in a way that stood out in a room full of loud voices. Her posture straight, her expression serene but distant, her soft ebony complexion illuminated by the string lights overhead. Her natural curls were pulled into a low puff, and she wore a deep green sweater dress that complemented her warm undertone. She spoke rarely, but when someone addressed her, she responded with a small, polite smile, gentle, reserved, and somehow heartbreaking. Daniel couldn't look away. He made his way over slowly, unsure why he felt nervous. Billionaires were not supposed to get nervous. But something about the quiet woman by the window made him feel like he was approaching a secret he wasn't sure he had the right to touch. When he reached her, she looked up. Her eyes the shade of rich earth after rain, deep, soft, quietly observant. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She blinked, surprised he was talking to her, then nodded. "Go ahead. I'm Daniel," he said as he settled beside her. "I know," she replied, a tiny smile curving her lips. "Everyone at this party knows." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's fair. And you are Abigail. Abigail Lake." He said her name softly, like testing the weight of it. "Nice to meet you." Abigail Lake. Something about the way he said it made heat rise to her cheeks. Their first conversation was effortless. Daniel asked thoughtful questions. Abigail answered cautiously at first, but his sincerity chipped away at her guardedness. He didn't ask about her past, her family, or anything too personal, just enough to make her feel seen without feeling exposed. When she spoke, he never looked away. He had a way of listening as though the world could wait until she finished her sentence. By the time the party wrapped up, Daniel knew he didn't want the night to end. So he asked, careful, hopeful, "Can I see you again?" She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because something in her chest tightened with fear. She pushed it down. "Yes," she finally whispered. "I'd like that." Their courtship was slow, sweet, gentle. Daniel treated her with a kind of reverence she wasn't used to. Dates at small cafes, long walks along the Charles River, hours of talking about everything and nothing. He never touched her without asking first, not even to hold her hand. He learned quickly that sometimes she pulled away emotionally without warning. Other times she fell silent for reasons she never explained. He didn't press. She never told him why. Still, he stayed. And gradually, piece by piece, Abigail let him in. When he proposed a year later, she said yes with trembling hands. And when they married in a small ceremony overlooking the Boston Harbor, Daniel felt like he had been handed the most precious thing in the world. He had no idea how much she was still hiding. 6 months into the marriage, everything looked perfect from the outside. A stunning penthouse overlooking the city. 2 successful careers, Daniel's thriving business empire and Abigail's growing work as a freelance illustrator. Friends who admired their relationship. Family who adored Abigail and respected Daniel. But behind the bedroom door, cracks were forming. Every night was the same. Abigail lying stiffly on the far edge of the bed, body turned away, shoulders tight beneath the duvet. Daniel lying beside her, staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering where he had gone wrong. It started subtly, a flinch when he touched her arm, a tense inhalation when his hand brushed her waist, an involuntary step back when he kissed her neck one evening. At first he told himself it was stress. Her freelance workload had increased. She often skipped meals when working on a project. Maybe she was tired. Maybe he needed to slow down. But the distance grew, and grew, and grew. One evening, When he came up behind her in the kitchen and rested a hand on her shoulder, she jerked so violently the knife she was using clattered onto the counter. "Sorry," she whispered, eyes wide, voice shaking. He pulled his hand back as if burned. "You don't have to apologize." But she did. "I'm fine," she insisted. Just startled. She always said she was fine, even when her entire body said she wasn't. Daniel tried to communicate, tried to understand, tried to be patient. Every conversation ended the same way. "What's wrong, Abigail? Nothing. Talk to me." "I'm fine." "Please let me in." "I'm okay, really." He didn't want to push her, but her silence was cutting him open. Sometimes he caught her staring at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Fear, sorrow, maybe guilt, before she quickly looked away. She avoided intimacy completely. Months passed without a single night of closeness, not even a lingering kiss. Daniel wasn't a man driven solely by physical needs. What hurt him wasn't the lack of sex, it was the lack of trust. The feeling that she was shutting him out of a room he didn't even know existed. One night he tried again. They were lying in bed, the city lights glowing faintly through the curtains. Abigail was on her side, curled inward, already holding herself like a shield. Daniel shifted closer, reaching slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to. "Abigail." His voice was soft. "Can I hold you?" She didn't answer. He wrapped an arm around her waist gently, carefully, hoping she would let him. For a moment she stayed still. Then she froze. Her muscles locked. Her breath hitched. Her body turned cold beneath his touch. Daniel withdrew instantly, heart shattering. He rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling with burning eyes. He said nothing because he didn't trust his voice not to break. "Good night," she whispered, voice trembling. He didn't respond. Abigail waited until she heard his breathing steady, then quietly cried into her pillow. She hated herself for hurting him. She hated the fear that crawled into her skin every time he touched her. She hated that she couldn't give her husband the love he deserved. Inside her chest, guilt and terror battled constantly. Love pulling her forward, trauma dragging her back. Daniel lay awake just as long, silently devastated. He loved this woman more than anything, but every attempt he made to reach her only widened the space between them. He didn't understand, and not understanding was slowly killing him. He had run businesses, negotiated billion-dollar deals, navigated crisis after crisis, but he couldn't navigate his own wife's silence. He felt like he was failing her, failing as a husband. And as Abigail wiped her tears in the dark, her heart cracked under the weight of the truth she could never speak. She had married him hoping the ghosts of her past would dissolve in the warmth of his love. But they hadn't, not even close. The emotional contrast between them grew sharper with each day. Daniel's longing versus Abigail's panic. His need for closeness versus her terror of it. His confusion versus her silence. It all came to a head the night Daniel stood in the living room long after Abigail had gone upstairs. He stared at the framed wedding photo on the mantel. Abigail smiling, Daniel looking at her like she hung the moon. "I can't lose her," he whispered to the empty room. But he was losing her, inch by painful inch. Standing there with the city lights stretching endlessly outside the glass walls, Daniel came to a desperate, reckless realization. Gentle patience wasn't working. Asking her wasn't working. Pretending everything was fine wasn't working. If he didn't do something soon, the marriage would quietly collapse under the weight of secrets he wasn't allowed to know. He needed to force clarity, not to hurt her, never that, but because he was drowning in confusion, and she refused to reach for him. It would be an extreme test, a terrible idea, one he hated himself for even considering, but he was desperate, completely, utterly desperate, and he didn't see any other way. And Daniel, staring at the staircase where Abigail had disappeared minutes before, made a choice that would change everything for better or for worse. Daniel regretted the plan the moment he stepped out of the elevator with Mira beside him. His secretary walked slightly ahead, talking about a meeting she had rescheduled, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor of the penthouse foyer. Daniel forced a laugh at something she said, even though he didn't hear a word. Every sound felt foreign, wrong, heavy. He hated this. He wasn't the kind of man who played games, especially not with the woman he loved, more than anyone on earth. But after 6 months of gentle attempts, patient questions, and silent suffering, he had reached a point where he needed answers. He needed something to shake Abigail out of the impenetrable shell she'd built around herself. He told himself he wasn't truly trying to hurt her. He told himself it was just a nudge. He told himself it was the only option left. Still, his stomach twisted with guilt as he walked, deeper into the home he had promised. Would always be safe for her. Mira kept speaking, oblivious. She was friendly, competent, and loyal to a fault, but completely unprepared for the storm she was about to walk into. They rounded the corner into the living area just as Abigail descended the stairs. She froze the second she saw them. It was instantaneous. Her entire body stiffened, her hand tightening on the railing, her breath catching sharply. Daniel felt the ground tilt. Abigail's expression shifted through a rapid sequence confusion. Disbelief, hurt, deep hurt, the kind that felt like betrayal. She took in the sight her husband, smiling too warmly at another woman, Mira's hand briefly touching Daniel's arm as she pointed something out in her planner. The closeness that shouldn't have been there. Abigail's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes glimmered with something Daniel had never seen in her before, jealousy, not petty jealousy, not insecurity, but the kind born of fear, the kind that said, I can't lose you, even if I don't know how to keep you. Daniel's heart cracked open. He hadn't expected the reaction to be so visceral. He hadn't expected it to hurt him so much. Mira finally noticed Abigail and smiled politely. Mrs. Spencer, good evening. Abigail didn't respond. Her gaze remained on Daniel, searching for something, truth, reassurance, or confirmation of the worst possibility. Abigail, Daniel said carefully, stepping forward. You're home early. She blinked slowly. The disbelief on her face hardened into anger, quiet, sharp, devastating. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes glistened. Then she turned around and walked away without a single word. Silent retreat. It was worse than yelling. Worse than accusations. Worse than tears. Daniel felt each of her steps like a blow. His plan had worked, but at a cost he hadn't fully anticipated. Abigail made it upstairs before the first tear slipped down her cheek. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to inhale, but her breath came out uneven and shallow. Her thoughts spiraled too fast to catch. He brought her here? He touched her? He smiled at her like that? Daniel, my Daniel, why? Her heart raced out of control. She stumbled into the bedroom and gripped the edge of the bed to keep from sinking to the floor. A sob clawed its way up her throat, but she swallowed it back violently. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to need him, but she did, desperately, painfully. Downstairs, Mira stood frozen, confusion creasing her forehead. She glanced at Daniel uncertainly. Should I go? Daniel nodded quickly. Yes, thank you, Mira. I'll see you tomorrow. She didn't need further explanation. Whatever had just happened wasn't professional and wasn't her business. She packed up her things in silence and left within seconds. The moment the front door clicked shut, Daniel ran upstairs. He paused outside the bedroom, forcing himself to wait just a moment for the truth to settle. His breathing steadied into something grim, determined, aching. Then he opened the door. Abigail stood by the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself, shoulders trembling. The city lights flickered against her wet cheeks. She didn't turn when she heard him enter. Abigail, Daniel's voice cracked on her name. He stepped inside slowly as though approaching a wounded creature. Please look at me. She wiped her cheeks roughly with the back of her hand. I'm fine. It was the same line she always gave him. But this time it was soaked in heartbreak. Daniel moved closer. You're not fine. I said I'm fine. Her voice sharpened, but her hands were shaking too much to carry the lie. He didn't reach for her, he didn't dare. Instead, he came around to stand in front of her, blocking the window so she couldn't avoid his face. What is it, Abigail? He whispered. Please tell me what I did wrong. At first, she kept her gaze down. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. Her fingers dug into her arms. She looked like she was fighting something too big to win against. Then finally, she looked up at him. Anne broke. A sob ripped out of her, raw and uncontrollable. Her knees buckled and Daniel caught her before she hit the floor. Abigail, hey, he whispered, holding her as carefully as he could without triggering the flinch he'd grown used to. I'm here. It's okay. You can cry. Let it out. But it wasn't okay. Nothing had ever been okay. She shook her head violently, words spilling out in fragmented gasps. I didn't want to feel like this. I didn't want to. Daniel, I'm so sorry. He held her tighter, not in a possessive way, but like anchoring someone drowning. It's not your fault, he murmured. She pulled back suddenly, pressing a hand against his chest to keep distance. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wild with pain. You don't understand, she choked out. You don't know why I'm like this. Then help me understand, he begged softly. Please. She pressed both hands to her face, sobbing into her palms. When she finally forced the words out, they came with the weight of years, no decades of silence. My foster father, she whispered. When I was a child, Her voice collapsed. Daniel's entire body went still. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Abigail forced the rest out through sobs so violent they shook her entire frame. He abused me, not once, not twice, for years. I was a kid, Daniel. I was a child. Daniel's vision blurred with hot, instant tears. His chest tightened with something boiling in vicious rage, grief, disbelief. But he didn't interrupt her. She continued, words spilling from a place too deep to bury anymore. Every time you touch me, even gently sometimes, my body remembers. I don't want it to. I want to love you freely, but I get scared and I hate myself for it. Daniel lifted shaking hands toward her cheeks but stopped halfway, waiting, always waiting for her permission. She didn't flinch this time, so he touched her face gently, brushing away a tear with his thumb. Abigail closed her eyes, more tears streaming. I always thought marriage would fix me, she whispered. That loving you would erase everything he did. I thought if I tried hard enough it would all go away. She opened her eyes, looking utterly shattered. But it didn't, and instead I've been shutting you out, hurting you, and I don't know how to stop. Daniel's heart broke open completely. He pulled her into him again, not as a man wanting his wife, but as someone holding a fragile heart that had been broken by someone else long before he arrived. Oh, Abigail, his voice trembled. You should have never carried this alone, never. She sobbed against his chest, gripping his shirt in her fists as though terrified he would disappear. I didn't want to lose you, she whispered. You won't. His hand stroked her back soothingly. I'm so sorry. For everything. For dragging Mira here. For trying to make you jealous. I swear to you I'll never hurt you like that again. Her crying softened into slow, uneven breaths. Daniel cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. I'm furious, he said quietly. Not at you, never at you. At the man who hurt you. At the pain he left behind. At the fear he carved into your life. Abigail's lips trembled. But hear me, Daniel whispered. I will help you heal. Properly, patiently, in every way you need. I'm not leaving. I'm not giving up. Not now, not ever. Her eyes fluttered shut. More tears falling, but these were quieter. Soaked with relief more than panic. She leaned into him, exhausted, broken open, but finally unburdened. I don't want to lose you, she repeated weakly. Daniel held her as though anchoring her to life itself. You won't, he vowed. I'm right here. And I'm not going anywhere. Abigail collapsed into his embrace, no walls. No lies, no distance while. Daniel held her with the fierce tenderness of a man who had finally been given the truth he always sensed but never imagined. The truth that would now shape their path forward. The morning after Abigail's confession felt different, quiet, weighted and fragile. Daniel moved through the penthouse on careful steps, as though the walls themselves were made of glass. Abigail sat at the kitchen island, hands curled around a mug of tea, her eyes swollen but clearer than he had seen in months. Neither of them pretended nothing happened, but neither rushed to fill the silence. It was a beginning, unsteady, painful but honest. Therapy begins. Daniel spent the next 3 days calling every trauma specialist in Boston who had experience with childhood sexual abuse survivors. He read reviews, watched interviews, and spoke to multiple offices until he found the one name that kept resurfacing. Dr. Eleanor Marsh, a therapist known for her compassion and work with childhood trauma. He scheduled an appointment immediately. Abigail's hands shook the morning of her first session. She paced the living room, her breaths coming shallow and quick. What if I can't talk, she whispered. What if I freeze or cry or say something stupid? Daniel stepped closer, making sure she saw every movement before he made it. Then you freeze or cry. Or say something stupid, he said softly. Whatever happens, I'll be right outside. Her eyes glistened. She nodded. He drove her himself, because he wanted to be the one she saw the moment she stepped out. The city passed by in a blur as they traveled through winter streets. Slush melting along the sidewalks, Boston's skyline heavy under gray clouds. Abigail fiddled with her sleeve, and Daniel kept his eyes forward, giving her space. At the clinic, he walked her inside, waited while she checked in, then sat in the lobby until she was called. He didn't touch her, didn't push. He simply stood beside her, a quiet reassurance. When her name was called, he pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "I'll be right here," he whispered. She nodded again, breathing shakily, and followed Dr. Marsh down the hallway. The first session was brutal. Abigail emerged 47 minutes later with red eyes, trembling hands, and a distant, exhausted expression. She looked like she had run a marathon in the snow. Daniel stood the second he saw her. She couldn't speak. She didn't need to. He simply cupped her cheek slow, telegraphed gentle. "Let's go home." The drive was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of someone carrying something heavy and knowing she wasn't carrying it alone. Every session after that was similar, difficult, draining, filled with flashbacks she had suppressed for years, shame that suffocated her, tears that came without warning. But she went, every single time, and every time Daniel drove her. Some days he waited in the lobby. Other days he waited in the car. Once, when the session was especially hard, he found her curled in a chair just inside the door, her head in her hands. He knelt beside her, rubbing small circles on her back until her breathing steadied. He never asked what happened inside. He only asked, "What do you need?" The answer changed daily, but he provided every time. The marriage rebuilding happened slowly, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in tiny steps that felt monumental. They talked more, not about the abuse that came only during therapy, but about the fallout, the fear she had lived with, the confusion he had endured, the hurt neither of them spoke of for 6 months. "I felt like you didn't want me," he admitted one night as they sat on opposite ends of the couch. His voice was soft, but the ache in it was unmistakable. Abigail swallowed hard. "I wanted you," she whispered. "I want you. I just didn't know how to be close without feeling something else. Something I didn't want to feel." He nodded, breathing through the pain. "I never wanted to make you afraid," he said. "I know," she murmured. "That's why it hurt. Because I knew you weren't the danger, but my body didn't." They talked about dreams, about a future where she wasn't haunted by shadows of the past. They talked about normality, morning walks, shared dinners, inside jokes, the kind of life they had started building but never fully lived in. Daniel began adjusting the house not in obvious ways, but in subtle ones meant to steady her world. Softer lighting in the bedroom, weighted blankets on the couch, lavender diffusers in the corners of the living room, warm lamps instead of bright overhead lights, calming music in the evenings. He cooked more, set gentle routines, brought comfort into every space. He made the house feel safe. And Abigail noticed. She noticed everything. Tender moments. One evening, a few weeks into therapy, Daniel was cleaning up dinner when he felt arms wrap around him from behind. He froze, not out of fear but out of shock. Abigail had leaned into him, her cheek pressed against his back, her arms tentative but willing. "Thank you," she whispered into the fabric of his shirt. "For everything, for staying." He turned slowly, carefully. "I'm here," he murmured, and for the first time in months she let him hold her without flinching. It was small, but it was everything. A week later, they sat on the couch watching a nature documentary. Abigail's head slowly, gradually drifted onto his shoulder. Daniel held perfectly still, afraid to break the moment. But eventually, when her breathing evened into something warm and delicate, he let his cheek rest against her hair. She slept there for almost an hour. Another morning, they walked through the Boston Public Garden. Snow clung to the edges of pathways, and the pond was half frozen. Abigail walked beside him quietly, eyes down. Then, without warning, her fingers brushed his. She hesitated. He didn't move. A second later, she slid her hand properly into his, squeezing gently. Daniel nearly stopped breathing. "Is this okay?" she whispered. He swallowed hard. More than okay. He kept his hand relaxed, careful not to grip too tightly, letting her lead. These small gestures stitched their marriage back together thread by fragile thread. Daniel learned to move slowly, to approach gently, to speak softly when her shoulders tensed, to ask before touching, to give space when she needed it. Abigail learned that touch didn't have to be a threat. That warmth didn't have to hurt. That love wasn't something to fear. That Daniel wasn't him. The turning point came on an afternoon marked by gray skies and light snowfall. Abigail exited her therapy session with a different expression, not shattered, Not exhausted, but contemplative. She moved with a steadiness he hadn't seen before. When she reached him, she took a long breath. "I had a breakthrough today," she said softly. Daniel turned fully toward her. Yes, she nodded, eyes glistening not from crying but from realization. "I finally let myself say it without shame. What he did. What it did to me. And that it wasn't my fault." Her breath trembled. "I think I'm finally starting to believe it." Daniel felt something warm and profound bloom in his chest. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "And I want to try." He tried not to assume anything. Try what her gaze softened in a way he'd longed for but never pushed for. "Closeness," she whispered. "Intimacy. With you. But only when I'm ready." Daniel's throat tightened. Emotion pressed behind his ribs with a force that nearly broke him. He reached out slow, telegraphed, lifting her chin gently with 2 fingers. "Take your time," he said, voice thick with sincerity. "Your healing matters more than anything else. I'm not rushing you. I'm not expecting anything." Her eyes softened further. Trust glowed there, new, delicate, but real. "I know," she whispered. He pulled her into his arms, and this time, this precious, impossible time, she didn't tense. She melted against him, fully, completely. It was the closest they had ever been, without fear between them. Later that night, sitting together in the warm glow of the living room, Abigail curled her legs beneath her and said, "When I finish my therapy program, can we go somewhere, just us? Somewhere quiet, somewhere new?" Daniel smiled. "A vacation," she nodded. "A new beginning." He brushed her knuckles with his thumb. "Anywhere you want." And for the first time in their marriage, Abigail believed the future could hold something bright, something free, something safe. Not because of the therapy alone, not because of time alone, but because Daniel had stayed, because she had fought, because they were rebuilding together, and the slow warmth returning between them was the strongest proof of all. The plane touched down just after noon, the soft glow of a tropical sun flooding the windows like a warm welcome. Abigail Lake sat with her fingers intertwined with Daniel Spencer's, her heart both nervous and hopeful. This vacation was more than a getaway. It was a doorway, a threshold, a symbolic beginning to the life she'd been rebuilding piece by piece. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You okay?" She nodded, giving him a small smile. "More than okay." He watched her for a second longer, as if studying the brightness in her eyes, the ease in her shoulders, a softness he had waited months to see return, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to breathe. Their destination was a secluded coastal resort, warm sands, quiet waves, and a calm that felt almost medicinal. Privacy had been important. Abigail didn't want crowds, bustling streets, or anything loud enough to drown out her thoughts. She wanted stillness, and Daniel wanted whatever helped her heart feel steady. When they stepped onto the balcony of their villa, the sea stretched endlessly before them, waves brushing against the shore like whispered promises. Abigail leaned on the railing, inhaling deeply. "It feels peaceful," she said softly. "It does," Daniel replied, slipping an arm around her waist, careful and slow. She didn't flinch. That alone felt like a miracle. Over the next few days, life settled into a gentle rhythm. They walked along the shore barefoot, letting the warm water wash over their ankles. They ate breakfast, beside open windows where sunlight spilled, across the table in golden stripes. At night, they read books or talked in bed close, but not pushing past what Abigail was ready for. And for the first time since they were married, Daniel felt no tension in her touch. She leaned into him naturally, rested her head on his chest, even laughed more freely. Therapy had softened the hard knots in her spirit, but this place, this quietness, was letting something deeper unfurl. On their 4th evening, the sky was painted with streaks of coral and amber. They sat on the beach after dinner, watching the sun slide toward the horizon. Abigail was unusually quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing steady but thoughtful. Daniel glanced at her. "You're somewhere far away in your mind," he said gently. "I'm not far," she whispered. "Just thinking." He waited, patient, giving her the space she always needed. Finally, she turned to him fully, her eyes searching his. "Daniel," she said softly, "can we go inside?" Something in her tone made his pulse shift, not with desire, but with a deep awareness, an understanding that this moment mattered. They walked back to the villa, the soft rustle of palm leaves echoing above them. Inside, Abigail closed the door slowly and turned toward him, her breath deepening, her expression tender but uncertain. "Sit with me," she said. He obeyed, sitting on the edge of the bed. She stood in front of him for a moment, her hands trembling slightly, not in fear but in emotion. She reached forward, resting her palms on his cheeks. "You've been so patient," she whispered, "so gentle, and you've never asked me for anything I wasn't ready to give." "You don't owe me anything," he said immediately, voice rough with sincerity. "I know, that's what makes this real." She let out a shaky breath. "Daniel, I want to try. I want to be close to you, not because I feel pressured or because I think I have to, but because my heart says yes." He stared up at her, stunned by the softness in her voice, the bravery in her words. His hands rose to hers slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. "Are you sure?" he whispered. She nodded. "Yes, I'm ready, and I trust you." Her trust after everything felt like the greatest gift he had ever been given. He stood lifting her hands with his and kissed her forehead first, tenderly. There was no rush, no urgency, just warmth, steady and patient. Abigail leaned into him, her breathing calm, her body relaxing without hesitation. They kissed, soft at first, then deeper with mutual understanding. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer with a longing that surprised even her. For once, her mind wasn't filled with fear or shadows. She felt present, safe, cherished. As they moved together, every touch was slow, every gesture gentle. Daniel treated her as something precious, not fragile or breakable, but treasured. His hands were warm and steady on her skin, his voice soothing whenever emotion overwhelmed her. Abigail realized, somewhere in the quiet rhythm of their closeness, that this was the first time in years her body didn't feel like a battleground. Instead, it felt like home, like something she could reclaim with someone who had earned every layer of her trust. By the time they lay tangled in each other afterwards, the room glowing with the soft light of a bedside lamp, Abigail felt a peace she had forgotten existed. Daniel held her close, his fingers tracing light patterns on her arm. She rested her head against his chest. "This feels right," she whispered. "It does," he murmured. You were incredible." She laughed softly, emotional. "I never thought I'd get here." "Not really. But with you, it feels possible." He kissed the top of her head, his chest rising with a deep, grateful breath. "I'm proud of you, more than you know." That night they drifted to sleep wrapped in each other, bodies warm, hearts settled. For the first time since their marriage began, there were no locked doors between them. Only openness, only love. When they returned to Boston, something had undeniably changed. Their home felt different, brighter, fuller, safer. Abigail moved with a lightness that Daniel noticed immediately. She hummed while cooking. She kissed him good morning without hesitation. She leaned into his embrace and didn't shy away when he touched her waist while passing her in the kitchen. The healing wasn't perfect. Trauma never disappeared entirely, but the shadows no longer controlled her. She was living forward now, not backward. 2 months slipped by with this new warmth between them. Then one morning, Abigail woke with a wave of nausea that left her clutching the bathroom sink. Probably just something I ate, she thought. But the nausea didn't fade. It returned the next morning. And the one after that. Daniel fussed, worried she was sick. But Abigail had her own silent suspicion brewing in her mind. One afternoon, when Daniel left for a meeting, Abigail walked to the drugstore at the corner and bought a pregnancy test. Her hands shook the entire way home. In the quiet of their bathroom, she took the test and waited, breath held, heart pounding. When the result appeared, her knees nearly gave out. Positive. She pressed a hand over her mouth, tears filling her eyes, not from fear but from overwhelming, indescribable emotion. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, letting the joy and shock wash over her. She hadn't planned this. She hadn't expected it, but it felt right. When Daniel came home later that evening, she met him in the living room, standing near the window where the last light of sunset washed over her face. He paused instantly, sensing something in her expression. Warm, glowing, trembling. "Abigail," he said gently, placing his coat down. "Is everything okay?" She nodded, tears gathering again. Everything's good." He stepped closer, his brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" She swallowed, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Daniel, we're having a baby." The words left her lips like a prayer, like hope reborn. Daniel froze just for a heartbeat before the realization hit him fully. His hand covered his mouth, his eyes filling instantly with tears. He reached for her, pulling her into him with a soft, choked sound. His whole body trembled. "A baby?" he repeated, breathless. We're really having a baby?" Yes, she whispered against his chest. We are. Daniel cupped her face in both hands, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her trembling mouth. Tears streamed freely down his face. Abigail, I'm so proud of you. So grateful. So God, I'm so happy. She laughed through her tears, resting her hands over his. I never thought my life could look like this. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering, You deserve every joy coming your way. They stood that way for a long, quiet moment, holding each other in their Boston home. Hearts full, fears gone, futures bright. Later that night, as they curled together on the couch, Abigail rested a hand over her stomach. I used to think, she said softly, that my life would always be shaped by the things that hurt me, that I'd carry them forever. Daniel kissed the side of her forehead. You carried them long enough. She smiled, tears slipping again. Now I feel free. He pulled her closer, letting her head rest on his shoulder. I'll always protect your heart, always. I know, she whispered. And as the city lights glowed outside their window, Abigail Lake realized that she had walked from darkness into something bright, something safe, something hers. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, and Daniel, her husband, her healing, her home, held her like she was the most precious beginning he'd ever known. Thank you for being part of Whispers of Hope. Your love and support mean more than words. Together we're spreading light, one whisper at a time.